This is an example of a contract where the end buyer purchased directly from the original seller. Instead of an A to B and B to C, this is an A to C. It was done by an assignment of contract. The seller A, or the property owner, sells to an end buyer C, but the investor is paid a profit using his assignment of contract and as an assignment fee on the HUD-1 closing statement. There's no money needed, purely an assignment of contract. No credit required because there's no conventional lender involved. The end buyer C is a cash buyer. There's no risk because the student had no money in the deal. In this example, you're going to see why the seller didn't care about the large assignment fee at closing. He was just concerned about solving his problem. That's what a motivated seller is. He wants you to solve his problem. He's not concerned about what price do I get. Every time you dance around with a seller and all they're talking about is where other properties have sold down the street or across the street or somewhere else for more money, you don't have a motivated seller. What you're there for is to solve the problem that they have and not focus on the highest possible price. In the truest sense of the word, this truly motivated seller just didn't care. In this deal, the seller was under the gun, so to speak, because of a pending tax deed sale. His choice was to sell to an investor who could close very quickly, or he would lose his property to a buyer at the tax deed sale. It's all or nothing. Turns out the seller owed more than $30,000 in back taxes, and the price the investor offered the seller was to net $5,000 at closing. You'll see that on the HUD statement where the actual net figure is $5,000. The end buyer was another investor who was motivated enough to give our student a $25,000 assignment fee for the assignment of his contract. In essence, on an assignment of contract, the end buyer C steps into the shoes of the investor, who is normally would be the B buyer. The investor signs the contract with the original seller. The end buyer C literally comes to the closing table as if he were the investor B. So now we're going to look at the HUD-1 closing statement, the A to C transaction, page 1. As you can see, the investor originally contracted with a seller for a purchase price of $42,000. There's the seller receiving the $42,000. Now, obviously, there's no profit in here if the original seller was getting $42,000 and our student was getting $42,000. So he's marked it up to the end buyer C. But the end buyer C is paying $42,000 also. So let's go through this and show you where the profit's actually coming in. As you'll notice, the expenses from the second page of the HUD, the closing cost, amounted to $26,325. That seems to be an enormous number, but if we look at that, it's also $34,000 and change. The seller. Typically, we're looking at a few $1,000s at the most on these expenses from the second page, except where there's a realtor involved with a commission. So we're going to get to page 2 so you can see how these numbers play out. Here's the accrued taxes, and this is a partial payment because the taxes have been paid through the year already, and they're $532.23. As always, they're charged to the seller and credited to the buyer. Now, this is the deposit that was put up, $5,000. It should have been put up by the B buyer, our student. But in fact, what we did is we had the end buyer C actually put up the $5,000. He gets a credit for it down here at the bottom on the HUD statement. And here's the amount that the end buyer C actually had to bring to closing, $63,857.33. That was not his purchase price. His purchase price is right here. It's $68,000. Student bought it at $42,000. Sold it at $68,000. Now here's the property taxes for the entire year, but again we got a credit up here for it for the partial year. And there's the bottom line. The seller, who's under the gun to take some money away from closing, actually received the $5,000 that the student promised him. Net figure on the HUD. So let's go to page 2. Here's our settlement or closing fee for the end buyer C. Same thing for the seller, and he also paid for the abstracted title. We didn't choose the closing agent in this case, so that's one of the reasons why he paid for the title. He wanted to choose his own agent, which is fine. Our buyer had an attorney involved to do some documentation, and there's a charge for the attorney. These are additional fees, and I'm not even going to go through them because they're not important wire fees. so on and so forth. The important fees are coming up. This is another electronic recording fee that we have. So here's the important numbers. These numbers are where it's all coming from, so to speak. As you can see here, there's $30,389.16 due for back taxes. Had the seller not agreed to this closing, he would have gotten nothing. The tax deed sale would have happened, and the bidding would have started at $30,389.16 and gone up, presumably. There's a little known fact about tax deed sales that could be very profitable to you. In the foreclosure arena, up until last 5 years, if you went to the homeowner before the foreclosure sale and said, I want to buy your home, and he said to you, well, it's going to go to sale tomorrow, and you said, well, sometimes I can work deals, I'll give you $500 for the deed. He said, what, are you crazy? I'll take the $500. Now, when the property went to sale and was sold, if it sold for more than what was due on the note, called overage, and the seller would receive the overage if there was no other liens in addition to the mortgage against the property. If there was other liens, they would be paid first, and then the overage would go to the homeowner. However, in this case, if you purchased the deed, you would get the overage. Hundreds of millions of dollars were made in the arena, foreclosure arena, collecting overage from the original seller by transferring the deed. How did you know whether to do that? It's simple. You did research on what it's worth, how much is owed. You went down to the auction, and you became a bidder on your own property. And what you did is you made sure the bids went above what was due, because you get fanatical bidders and people that don't know what they're doing. And every dollar it went above what was owed went to your pocket. Now, here's the most important part. I've got it marked student. It's a $25,000 charge to the end buyer. And as you can see here, it says assignment fee, $25,000. There's no mystery in this. And if you're talking to real estate agents or attorneys or closing agents who say you can't do this, here it is. It's done probably 1,000 times a week across the United States. By the end of the year, likely hundreds of millions of dollars are done by assignment fees on properties as much as $100 million in value. So don't worry about what people tell you. Find somebody that understands what we do. There's the $30,000 and change in taxes that I mentioned before. So the charge to the seller is $34,398.61. And I'm sure that the reason it came out to exactly $5,000 on the first page was because these odd numbers, $189, that's pretty unusual, $252, also unusual. What the closing agent did is he made these numbers work to make sure that $5,000 was net the seller on page 1 of the HUD. And there's the bottom line for our end buyer C, who had to bring in, who was charged $26,325 as his closing costs. So the final result of this transaction is this is an example of the purest form of deals that require no money from an investor. This is an assignment of contract. Obviously, if you need no money, why don't you do every one of them as an assignment? Because you can't. If you can, you should. $25,000 as an assignment fee is abnormally large, and oftentimes anything over $15,000 in our area will kill a deal. The seller will say, you've made too much money, and the end buyer will say, you've charged me too much. One or both of them are going to walk away from the closing. Now, can you bring them back to the closing? Yes, I'm not going to get into that now. But good is it if it costs you attorney's fees and a lot of time. So you need to make sure that if you're going to have, generally speaking, an assignment fee of $15,000 or more, just go ahead and do a double closing. Yes, there are additional costs to do it, but it's better than losing the deal. The property was facing a tax deed sale, as I mentioned before. Over $30,000 were due, and this was a duplex, by the way. So the landlord would have lost any equity he had in the property had he not sold it to the student. He was happy to walk away with the $5,000 and get rid of his pesky tenants. The student used the end buyer's earnest money deposit for the transaction, and the end buyer received a credit on the HUD-1 statement for it at closing, which I showed you. In these pre-tax deed sales, be careful that other liens don't exist, because you're going to have to assume them if you purchase and attempt to flip the property. I had a student call me today. He said, I just got a call back from a person in tax deed sales going tomorrow. Is there anything we can do? Yes. There is some things you can do, both from a legal aspect and from just outright paying the taxes that are due. However, the best option is to postpone the sale through a legal motion to the court or the clerk of the court, and then you have time to look at the title work, find out whether or not it's profitable, bothered with the property. There are times when you can look at these pre-tax deed sale properties and you'll see that $150,000 is owed on a $30,000 property. It's okay if you can get it postponed. You can work on literally going directly to the seller. Forget about real estate agents in between. They're not going to be listed. And say to them, you lose everything if it goes to the tax deed sale. Let's make a deal. That's how you get enormous discounts on some of these pre-foreclosure loans. The student's net profit for this no out-of-pocket money was $25,000 as an assignment of contract to his end buyer.